Hello, folks. Welcome to Dialogos, where philosophy is not just a conversation, but a way of life. In this episode, we turn inward, tracing the psychological roots of mystical philosophy. What kind of soul is drawn to the path of transcendence, and why do some minds seek not to just to understand reality, but to unite with it? As always, we invite you to join us in the space between thought and transformation. But before getting into the main discussion, I thought I would first offer a brief recap um, regarding where we left off last time. And in our third episode, we talked about the origins of mystical philosophy and examined the social dimensions relating to that. And first, we opened up our dialogue by grounding ourselves in a shared commitment to openness and curiosity, non attachment to fixed ideas. And we began by reflecting personally on why the topic mattered to us and then posed the central guiding question: what are the origins of mystical philosophy and why does it matter today? And we propose that no single factor can fully explain the origins of philosophy. Rather, it emerges from a complex interplay of dimensions, and these are social, metaphysical, and psychological. So, regarding the social dimension, we first explored how religious traditions, communal rituals, and collective symbols like the national flag or the way of righteousness in Pythagoras' philosophy shape mystical thought. And philosophy, in that sense, is not just abstract speculation, it is a lived way of life embedded in communal rhythms, rituals, and practices. It's not merely believing in cosmic harmony, for instance, but living in alignment with it through practices like dietary codes or shared contemplation of numbers in the case of Pythagoras. And we also explored tensions throughout our conversation. And we moved into a deeper stage of tension and divergence by exploring the core philosophical question: is mystical philosophy merely a social construct, or is it a response to something real, something metaphysical and enduring? And we challenged Cornford's sociological view, which argues that the origins are social in nature. Um, and we argued that his sociological view is necessary but insufficient. And we thought to ourselves, if we reduce mystical philosophy to collective representation alone, we risk dismissing its ontological depth, its potential to reveal something fundamental about the nature of reality. Drawing on Pythagoras as a touchstone, we noted how his vision of the cosmos, structured by number and harmony, was not just culturally symbolic, but ontologically assertive. The music of the spheres in this view isn't metaphorical, it's a claim about the real structure of existence. We asked, are mystical experiences mere projections of human meaning onto the cosmos? Or do they reveal something deeper, some hidden logos within reality itself? Ultimately, we lean toward the view that mystical philosophy arises from both cultural historical contexts and a deeper metaphysical structure, and is further animated by something intrinsic to human nature itself. We concluded by pointing toward the final idea. If, as Aristotle said, all men, by desire to know, uh, take two. If Aristotle said, quote, all men by nature desire to know, unquote, then mystical philosophy may be one of the purest expressions of that longing. It's not merely an adaptive cultural function. It is a response to the cosmos and to the mystery of being itself. So, building on our last conversation, where we explored the social and metaphysical dimensions of mystical philosophy, tonight we turn inward, asking what kind of person is drawn to philosophy in the first place? What are the psychological roots of the impulse, those deep seated traits, temperaments, and inner sensibilities that make some individuals seekers of truth, harmony, and transcendence. So at this point, Ryan, I'd like to open up the space for our dialogos, and I'd like to begin by creating this shared philosophical space. And I want to share um, this guiding question, I think, that can be our focus, and we can go forward in our conversation refining this question. But I guess in the most general way, we can put it this way: what are the origins of mystical philosophy, and why do they matter today? I think our general consensus so far is there are a variety of factors: social, metaphysical, psychological. And if we pursue this question even more narrowly in the context of psychology, then we might put it this way: if mystical philosophy is a response to both the structure of reality and something deep in human nature, what exactly in human nature gives rise to it? Is it just curiosity, or is there something more? Maybe an existential longing, a need to transcend the ordinary. Maybe certain personality traits like high openness to experience, deep emotional sensitivity, or an inclination toward altered states of consciousness. So, in other words, what kind of human being is drawn to mystical philosophy and why? So, I think that's the first key question I'd like to pursue, Ryan. Let me just give you my initial thoughts here, and then I'd be curious to get your take. So, I think that you know we're onto something important here. If mystical philosophy arises in part from human nature, then we need to examine what kind of human nature gives rise to it. And personality traits, particularly openness to experience, seems to be a strong explanatory factor. And openness, well, first of all, I think some preliminary definitions might be useful here. So, in talking about personality, what do we mean? Well, in the context of our discussion tonight, Ryan, I'm referring to personality in a specific sense according to the five factor model. And according to this model, personality refers to a stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that differentiate individuals. And um, among these patterns, there are distinctive traits included as well. And openness to experience is one of them. And this is just the um, pertains to imagination, curiosity, appreciation for art and novel ideas. So we see this exemplified in Pythagoras, for instance, with his synthesis of mathematics and mysticism and mystical speculation. Um, and I think in our podcast context, openness is the entry point trait into mystical philosophy. It's this deep curiosity about the hidden structures of reality, essentially. And so openness is differentiated from other traits like conscientiousness, which is a trait that involves organization, responsibility, and discipline. So a thinker who might exemplify that would be Immanuel Kant. He was known for his meticulous routines and systematic moral philosophy, for instance. Then we have extroversion, and extroversion is just defined as sociability, assertiveness, and enthusiasm. And I guess you could loop Nietzsche into the extroversion bin, at least in some respects. Although he was introspective, his bold public persona and emotional energy expresses this extroverted quality. Then we have agreeableness, and agreeableness is defined by compassion, warmth, and cooperativeness. So, one such figure that comes to mind is the American uh, clinical psychologist and therapist Carl Rogers, and he embodies the gentle, empathic nature of high agreeableness in his therapeutic philosophy. And then finally, we have neuroticism, and that's defined as emotional volatility, sensitivity to negative emotion. An exemplar of that would be Soren Kierkegaard. He was driven by an existential anxiety and a turbulent inner world, which fueled his philosophical depth. So maybe a bit more on that later, but that's personality, and those are the traits that define personality according to the five-factor model. Returning now back to our main thread, openness, like I mentioned, is tied to curiosity, imagination, a willingness to explore unconventional ideas. Those high in this trait aren't satisfied with surface level explanations. They're drawn to deeper, more abstract, often paradoxical inquiries. And that fits perfectly with what we see in Pythagoras and other mystical thinkers. So take Pythagoras. He wasn't just content with counting things, he saw numbers as the foundation of reality itself. He wasn't just interested in music, he saw cosmic harmonies structuring the universe. He wasn't just interested in ethics, he developed a mystical way of life that integrated philosophy, mathematics, and religious practice. So, all of this suggests a mind that isn't constrained by convention, someone deeply open to experience, unafraid of making connections between disciplines that might seem unrelated to others. So, those are my initial thoughts, Ryan, on the role of personality in shaping the emergence of mystical philosophy, especially this trait of openness, which I think is a core trait, maybe not the only trait. Maybe there's more to say about that further on. But at this stage of our dialogue, I'd just be curious to get your take on all of this and what role do you think personality plays in the formation of mystical philosophy?
I think the answer is probably pretty complex, and it can differ depending on the situation or the person. Um, I think the high openness is probably one of the key factors that might be, present amongst most people that have a mystical experience or lean towards mystical philosophy. Um, but I think there's certain factors that might be out of the individual's control in some sense when it comes to um, having a mystical experience. Um,
Okay.
and then there's also, with mystical philosophy, there's an element of needing solitude and like silence and the sort of aesthetic life. So, like, kind of removing yourself from the world a bit.
Hmm.
So, that can be seen as a little bit introverted. But then there's also mystical experiences that happen in groups in sort of extroverted settings.
Mm.
And so there's a bit of room there, I think, wiggle room in the personality traits that one might exhibit that could open them up to certain types of mystical experience. So
Mm.
not all mystical experiences are built the same, perhaps, um, and maybe not all mystical philosophies are built the same. But I think the high openness is definitely key, because that openness, I think what mystical philosophy is pointing to is sort of a dissolution of barriers, and like that
Hmm.
high openness there is sort of the gateway into seeing, like you were saying, connections between disciplines that might seem unrelated, or connections between people that were seemingly invisible before, but now you see like these forces and these principles working. You know what I mean? um
Right.
yeah, so being open to experience, I think, is probably number one. But the other ones, conscientiousness, I think might be important when it comes to mystical practice and
Hmm.
being a mystic, because being a mystic often requires like ritualistic practices, aestheticism, a certain level of discipline. And being a conscientious person, that will allow you to deepen your relationship with God, or, you know, increase your harmony with the universe. And that the intention of that, I believe, is to deepen your experience of the mystical, right? So the more that you engage in this practice conscientiously and mindfully, the more access to the mystical, the more access to God that you receive.
Right.
And that
Yeah.
that would
God.
require someone fairly conscientious to put that into practice and to continually deepen that relationship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Those are some, I think, profound insights you offer there, and I think they help to really deepen the conversation too. But there was a lot that you just outlined there in your response, and you highlighted, for instance, you know, the importance of individual differences, different personality traits, contributing to different worldviews and outlooks on life, and the mystical worldview is just one case in point. And you mentioned factors beyond our control regarding mystical philosophy. I think that's an interesting point. Um, it feels like personality, um, I would say, is probably to some extent within your locus of control, because I think you can mold your personality through cultivation in some ways. But maybe there's things beyond our locus of control too. And we'll look into this maybe a little bit later, but that's temperament, which is the biological basis of personality. It kind of forms the bedrock of personality from which personality can emerge, interacting with temperament and the influence of the environment as well. Um, and then there's just everything else beyond our, um, you know, um, I suppose our organism outside of us, like the weather, the atmosphere, the actions of others, and so on and so forth. So, um, our capacity to tap into the mystical experience is going to be constrained by all of these things too beyond our control, not just within our control. And another thing too, you mentioned solitude. That's important for a kind of mystical experience, as you mentioned. Um, for example, sitting cross legged on your meditation mat for 20 minutes, entering into a state of oneness, contrasts someone who, taps into a larger whole through a group ritual, for instance, and kind of feeling that they're a part of the universe through their participation in it with other people. And then what I was hearing that for mystical experiences, there's also variation within those themselves, and that the experiences arise from an interplay of factors. And obviously, openness is an important one, especially for um, connecting on many levels. I would say, um, I think openness. When I think of openness, I think of receptivity. I think of like the semi-permeable um, membrane cell, allowing things to come into it, filtered through the cell, but also registering that which is outside of it, and merging with it. Um, and and then finally, you touched on conscientiousness. That involves discipline, being organized, being like duty bound, and the significance of that with regards to mystical practice. And I thought that was interesting. And you were saying that it gives us access to the divine, and I think that's an interesting point too. Um, Whether we conceive of that as God or the source or the arche or the Tao or whatever, we can use whatever label we want. We're tapping into it through this trait, and I think that makes a lot of sense because I feel like um, mysticism is a practice. It is a lived philosophy, and to the degree that we can practice it with discipline and orderliness and dutifulness, I think we're going to um, enhance our mystical practice and our capacity to tap into that mystical dimension.
Yeah, I think foremost it being a practice, one thing that really, hit me was the purpose of the practice was to deep, more deeply entrench oneself in the mystical and to increase your access to the mystical experiences and to continue to open yourself up, right? It's not just about following a set of rules because it logically follows from, you know, these premises or what have you. It's there's a certain rhythm and a certain way to the world and to life that if you follow it, you will be blessed.
Yeah, yeah. It's not following rigidly following a set of um, you know ethical rules. For instance, do this, do that. Um, don't do this. Don't do that. It, in a way, it transcends that. It's more. For me personally, I feel like it's more visceral than that. It's something you can come into communion with, and at once it's something that you feel like it's a part of you, but it's not a part of you at the same time. And there's various ways of tapping into it, of course.
I would say that's Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or the Tao or Brahman, or that supreme metaphysical principle that maybe reality itself or being itself, capital B. Um, and in some ways it feels ineffable, like we're talking about the divine and the mystical. What do we mean concretely? Maybe that's for us to probe further as we go along. But you know, um, yeah, yeah. I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but we've kind of alluded to what the mystical experience is in some ways, and it's. I think it's in some ways it's like a living of truth and embodying of truth. Like you're not simply following the rule, be kind to others. You're being kind, and to be kind is to tap into that divine aspect of reality, to participate in it in some way. Um, so, so I think in some ways the divine is kind of the alignment of yourself with the ideal, the ideal human being, or the ideal, the ethical ideal, um, something along these lines, perhaps. I'd like to revisit that maybe at some point. Um, anyhow, yeah, maybe we can roll forward, Ryan. Not unless you wanted to get anything in that you wanted to say before we shift focus here.
We can roll on forward.
Okay, let's keep rolling then. So we were. So those are my initial thoughts. Those are Ryan's initial thoughts. I thought we could refine our questioning further in pursuing another line of thought, which is if openness to experience is a key driver of mystical philosophy, then why doesn't everyone with high openness become a mystic? And there are plenty of people today with high openness, artists, musicians, even theoretical physicists, who explore deep, unconventional ideas, but don't turn to mystical thought. So, what's the missing piece? Is it something beyond openness? Maybe temperament? Maybe something cultural that channels this openness in one direction rather than another? In other words, what distinguishes the mystic from the highly open but non mystical thinker? So let me offer you my initial thoughts, Ryan, and then I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. So, what I'm suggesting is that the difference between the mystical thinker like Pythagoras and a highly open but non mystical thinker isn't necessarily one of kind, but one of degree. And that makes a lot of sense, I think. So, if we take the five-factor model seriously, then openness to experience isn't just about mystical or spiritual interests, it manifests in a range of ways. Some high openness individuals become artists, channeling their abstraction and imagination into creative expression. And I think Andy Warhol is a good counter archetype here. Um, Warhol was undeniably high in openness. He was playful, he was experimental, he was imaginative, he was deeply attuned to cultural nuance, but his orientation wasn't metaphysical. Um, it was pop cultural. It was ironic. It was surface focused. His art didn't seek depth or transcendence, but rather exposed and played with the flatness of modern life. So then there's others who become theoretical physicists, and they're drawn to the deep structures of reality, but through an empirical lens. So here we have Richard Feynman as an example. Feynman was wildly imaginative, he was curious, he was deeply open, he loved puzzles, metaphors, even bongo drums, and painting. But he had a deep resistance to metaphysical speculation. He famously said, "I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong." So for him, beauty was in the mystery, but not in the mystical. He was enchanted by reality, but didn't seek union with it. He sought to map it, experiment with it, play with it. And then some become philosophers, even, but not necessarily mystics. They might pursue abstract questions about being and knowledge without embracing mystical experience. And one characteristic philosopher who comes to mind is Bertrand Russell. And Russell loved logic and abstract structures, and he sought precision in thought. Once he dabbled in mysticism early in life, but later turned sharply against it. For Russell, clarity, reason, and rigorous argument were sacred. His openness played out through analytical dissection rather than spiritual synthesis. And then, of course, some become mystics, seeking direct experiential insight into the nature of reality. So I think here um, we have a strong parallel to Pythagoras in Plotinus. And uh, Plotinus' whole project in the Aeneids, his masterpiece, is rooted in a direct transformative ascent of the soul toward the One. He doesn't just think about the metaphysical structure of reality, he seeks union with it. His metaphysics is lived, and like Pythagoras, he sees philosophy as a purification of the soul, a moral and spiritual discipline. And we could list more examples regarding um, these different types, Ryan. Um, but that's sort of my initial thoughts and some examples to support them. I'm curious to get your take now on this. What do you think distinguishes the mystic from the highly open but non-mystical thinker? What do you think is the what are the decisive um, features?
Well, if we're gonna stick with some personality or psychological traits, one thing that came to mind was neuroticism. Like
Okay.
high levels of neuroticism might lead people in perhaps a different direction,
Mm-hmm.
like away from mystical philosophy altogether. Like when I think of someone who's high openness and highly neurotic, person's not really uh, on the philosopher list.
Okay.
I mean, maybe, but it's like some people might just like be highly open and have like a lot of mental health issues, or you know um, there's lots of different directions neuroticism can take you.
Right. Right. Not.
So
Yeah.
that's one thing that was on my mind. But if I were to take this in a slightly different direction, um, you were talking about theoretical physicists, and I'm going to throw mathematicians in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even modern day mathematicians and like physicists or theoretical physicists, perhaps even regular physicists, I would almost lump them in with modern, like as modern day mystical philosophers, because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
them talk about the world as like everything being numbers, much like Pythagoras did. And if I were to reckon, they'd probably walk around the world looking at it through that lens, you
Right.
know? And they do a lot of, you know, things together, rituals together, I'm sure, to help like further their understanding and deepen their knowledge of these fields. I mean, I'm being a slightly hyperbolic, but
Mm-hmm.
you hear a lot of this, like even um, from mathematicians and physicists online, or even just uh, whatever YouTube videos talking about numbers being the base of everything, much like Pythagoras did.
Right.
It's weird to see in 2025.
Yeah. Well, I think your point's spot on. Do you have anything else you want to add? I had some thoughts just jump to mind as you were bringing that up as an example. I'm just curious, what do you think it is about mathematicians, as far as their personality goes, that would make them resonate with, say, mystical thinkers like Pythagoras?
I mean, the history and appeal to numbers, I think, and the sort of historical thread of Pythagoras and geometry and all of that. So I think there's probably a connection there to be made that it's just sort of a default thing that people learn about. They learn about Pythagoras. They learn about these things in math class, I'm sure. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
they learn some basis of the theoretical level of or the theory side of things. I'm sure they're not just bouncing around numbers, but I could be
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah.
I presume
Well,
every class has a bit of history to it
yeah.
or background.
Well, well. I mean, what I heard in what you were saying was that there's this maybe inherent curiosity within mathematicians to explore the sorts of questions and problems that um, you know Pythagoras um, was preoccupied with. Um, questions of um, you know order and the mathematical order and harmony of the universe, and how language represents that mathematical harmony, and not just represents, but you know, math in and of itself is part of um, being as such. It's the part of the fabric of reality, and maybe the mathematician has an inherent curiosity to figure out reality with um, with math, the language of reality, and um, you know, perhaps his openness isn't enough to make him a mystic. As mentioned, we have like thinkers like um, Feynman, for instance, and maybe he wasn't a pure mathematician because he was a physicist, but certainly mathematics is the language of physics. Um, I suppose he didn't dabble in the metaphysical so much, so maybe it's his proclivity to dabble in the metaphysical, um, that which we might call the divine, or the um, the fundamental principle of all being or of all reality. Um, Perhaps he wasn't. Maybe that's where his curiosity was limited, and he wasn't as much interested in experiencing that connectivity to the greater whole, um, through experience, through ritual, through prayer, through meditation. Um, that's one thing that comes to mind. So maybe there's a differentiating factor there that we can narrow in on. Um, I
When
think
one
that.
person I think of is Wittgenstein. Like
Mm-hmm.
when I think of like that curiosity, originally he was an engineer, became more interested in mathematics and then philosophy, right? So there's like this bent towards like wanting to know the truth, like with mathematics. I find it's like what is true,
Right.
and then I feel like there's just like this inevitable sort of leap that people take is like what is capital T truth or what
Right.
is capital T
Right.
true, and
Right.
um there so there that is taking their truth and trying to read it into the world of like what is capital T true,
Right.
so maybe there's like a connection there to be
Yeah.
made.
Yeah. I think there's a connection for sure. I know Russell too was a mathematician and a philosopher, so there definitely seems to be a relationship between the interest in mathematics and the interest in philosophy. And um, I think that in considering all of this, they were seekers of truth, but truth, what kind of truth are we talking about? Are we talking about um, an abstraction that we call the truth, like um, you know, um, that which we think about? Like I can think about certain mathematical formulas as being true, but then there's also sort of the experiential element of truth and inhabiting the truth, so and embodying the truth, um, and so maybe these things can be distinguished, and maybe say Bertrand Russell, for example, wasn't so much as interested in inhabiting the truth, but in thinking about it. But in any case, maybe we can move forward here as time marches on, and I know that time is finite for both of us here, so I'd like to get all of this in
One
at a
day we will
reasonable hour.
perish.
Yes, yes. So I think we can address a lot of the concerns you brought up, anyways, by shifting to the next round of questions here, especially this point you brought up about neuroticism, which I find to be interesting because I don't necessarily think it's at odds with um, the development and emergence of mystical philosophy, but more on that later. So um, let's further refine our questioning. A question I'd like to ask now is um, what pushes some people toward mystical philosophy rather than other outlets of deep inquiry? So, my initial thoughts are that one possibility is emotional temperament. And so, let's just again go over some definitions here. So, in contrast to personality, um, temperament is the biologic, biologically rooted core of personality. And it manifests early in life and it's more enduring than specific traits like those that I mentioned earlier. So think of it as the emotional climate that shapes how traits unfold. And in the context of our discussion, I think we can think about this notion of emotional temperament because I think it plays a role in influencing the development of um, mystical philosophy. And emotional temperament specifically refers to one's baseline emotional reactivity and sensitivity. And it includes tendencies like high sensitivity to beauty or harmony, proneness to awe or melancholy, a disposition toward compassion, longing, or spiritual yearning. And, we can think of exemplars of this as being like characters like um, Meister Eckhart or Pythagoras. These were mystical types. They were sensitive, introspective, driven by existential questions, spiritual aesthetics, and these types can contrast, say, non-emotional temperaments. Might say more empirical, rational types. So we've talked of Einstein in previous conversation, as I think a mystic in some sense. I think he's more of an intellectual mystic rather than like an experiential mystic. But he would contrast, some of these characters who have a more emotional temperament because though he's highly open and emotionally, though he's highly open, he's like emotionally distanced from mystical absorption. And he's fascinated by cosmic harmony, but he does not seek direct participatory union with it. And so that's temperament and emotional temperament specifically. And so um, I think that some high openness individuals like Pythagoras combine their abstract thinking with an intense emotional or existential drive that kind of originates from this emotional temperament. And they aren't just curious in an intellectual way, they're driven by a deep yearning for transcendence, for union with something beyond oneself. And say, compare that to Einstein. So I just mentioned him, but he was high in openness, but he was deeply engaged in theoria, which we previously talked about, which is just this contemplating of the mathematical structure of reality. But he never became a mystic in the experiential sense. He was fascinated by cosmic order, but wasn't drawn to ritual, direct mystical experience, or ecstatic states. His relationship to mystery was more intellectual awe than personal transformation. So maybe the difference between Pythagoras and a highly open non mystic isn't just about degree of openness, but about what kind of emotional orientation they bring to that openness. So those are my initial thoughts, Ryan. I'd be curious to hear if any of that resonated with you, or if you want to push back on any of that at all. I'm open to either.
No, I think that I never even thought about it that way, but I really like how that sounds. Um, I think the emotional temperament definitely plays a lot into the difference here between, like an Einstein figure versus Pythagoras. Um, I'd like to hear more about how that ties into maybe like neuroticism. Or were you gonna get into that a little bit?
Yeah, no, no, I'm happy to address that. I was just waiting for you to address it actually. So I can go into that with some brevity. So I think that neuroticism, as we talked about, is this negative uh, emotional dimension to personality. People who are neurotic tend towards the more negative spectrum of emotions. Melancholy, depressed mood, irritability, these types of things. So I think that my idea here is that neuroticism isn't necessarily opposed to cultivation or the propagation of mystical philosophy. I think that in the right measure, it gives the mystic fuel. It gives them the emotional intensity, the dissatisfaction, maybe even the anxiety that pushes them to seek resolution or relief. So I'd say um, it's a kind of pain. We might call it like the pain of not knowing, and I think this pain maps onto a moderate to high level of neuroticism, and when it's paired with openness, I think it provides the personality alchemy that catalyzes the mystical impulse. So, like a figure like Kierkegaard, I think might be a good example, or like Hamlet in Macbeth, or no, Hamlet in Hamlet. Uh, I got my Shakespeare wrong there, but yeah,
Sorry if
like
I
Hamlet
blew
and Hamlet.
anybody's ears out with that laugh, but
No, that's okay. That's
Macbeth.
okay. Um, yeah, we're allowed to butcher things on Dialogos Live because this is unfiltered. It's
Yeah.
it's raw. Um, there'll be no editing out of
Mhm.
any blunders on our parts for
So
these episodes.
what I hear you saying is that there sorry, there doesn't need to be, but um there's a benefit to having at least a certain level of neuroticism because it kind of gives someone sort of that existential push or drive towards, seeking, like you said, some sort of relief in the mystical um, rituals and experiences.
Yeah, yeah, precisely.
Mm-hmm.
It's to kind of satisfy an existential longing for, say, meaning. You
Yeah.
know, and someone who is neurotic might um, be deficient in meaning. Maybe that's the source of their neuroticism, their say their depression, and so that condition, say they're depressed, that um, that perpetual sadness that they're that they experience within moderation can be an ally because it can drive them to seek meaning out of all of their melancholy and depression and transcendent even to arrive at a different place, a maybe a more emotionally stable place through this existential drive, you know, um, prompted, you know, by this negative emotion, but ultimately seeking maybe a relief of that motion and emotion and a maybe an alignment with a greater whole that helps one to transcend all of that. Um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. I'm, I support this message.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think maybe you're revising your previous assumptions about neuroticism, which is good. I mean, this is what Dialogos is about, right? It's about transforming the way we think and um, more generally transforming ourselves ultimately through changing our thoughts, through changing our the way we experience and see things. And
Definitely helped
any
me
case,
refine it a lot better. Like I was thinking neuroticism, like perhaps in the extreme case, like it didn't even cross my mind that like a moderate level of neuroticism might actually be good and like fuel for that, right? And if you think about it, like, you know, I would consider myself as someone who is fairly neurotic, and I
Yeah.
do kind of have a bend towards that, so it's hard for me to disagree.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's I think I definitely resonate too with that idea. And I think that I have a good pinch of neuroticism within my own personality. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think often it's stigmatized. But I think it's not necessarily a bad thing if it's not debilitating. Um, and so, I feel I think that's a ripe topic for conversation. Actually, I'd be curious to go into discussing that maybe at length for another podcast episode, and maybe exploring some of the psychological archetypes of that personality trait. Because I think we could uh, come up with quite a bit. Think artists, musicians, even scientists who have been neurotic in that sense, right? Um,
Especially
but
musicians and artists.
yeah, no kidding, right? Um, yeah, the Van Goghs and um, yeah, the rock stars, the Kurt Cobains. Yeah, but well, in any case, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole necessarily, but it's a one worth pursuing at some point. So, anyways, Ryan, I know we're pushing the limits of our time here. I was hoping that you'd just be willing to stick it out, and we're pretty much now past the climax of our conversation, I think, and everything else is just more or less a synthesis and a wrapping up. So, are you on board to just stick around for maybe another 15? Cool, man.
Let
Appreciate
me
it.
make sure I
So,
got enough water.
all right, yeah,
Good to go.
yeah. Philosophers got to stay hydrated. That's a sign of an experienced philosopher. So, in any case, I'd like to now bring our conversation to a synthesis. And, um, you know, as our conversation has deepened, I think um, patterns have emerged, connections have emerged. And, Socrates traditionally at this stage of the conversation would, synthesize all of these patterns and connections together through the dialectic, resolving tensions by refining ideas or finding a higher truth that encompasses them both. So that's what I'd like to do at this point. And first, I'd want to just kind of revisit some of the core questions we put forward in the beginning in our previous conversations. So, what distinguishes mystical philosophy from other kinds of philosophy? What are the origins of philosophy? How do mystical and psychological factors lay the groundwork for philosophical inquiry? How does the combination of these factors lay the groundwork for philosophical inquiry? And can we trace modern philosophy's roots back to social, metaphysical, or psychological factors? If so, how? So I think these are some of the core syntheses that we've come up with, Ryan. And anywhere along the way, I'd be happy to get your feedback on any of this. Um, so, in anyways, this first point is that mystical philosophy is a continuum rather than a category. So, we started with the question of what distinguishes mystical philosophy from other kinds of philosophy, and we've arrived at this idea that it's not a strict opposition, but a difference of degree rather than kind. And rational and mystical thought often overlap, and many thinkers, Pythagoras, Spinoza, Einstein, exhibit both. Mystical philosophy integrates experience and intuition with rational contemplation, a fusion we see in Pythagorean theoria. So, second point is the multiple origins of philosophy. So, we rejected a single explanation for the origins of philosophy and instead identified three interwoven factors. First of these was social. Mystical philosophy arises within collective representation, shared symbols, rituals, and meaning making practices that structure experience. Also, metaphysical factors. It also emerges as a response to something real, perhaps grounded in the ontological depth of reality itself. If the cosmos is structured harmoniously, as Pythagoras believed, mystical thought might be an uncovering rather than an invention. And finally, psychological factors. High openness to experience, emotional temperament, existential longing seem to drive individuals toward mystical inquiry rather than purely rational analysis. Third synthesis, the role of personality and emotional temperament. We explored why some highly open individuals, Pythagoras, become mystics, while others, Einstein, theoretical physicists, abstract artists, do not. Emotional temperament, especially sensitivity to awe, longing for transcendence, and existential intensity, may be the missing ingredient that tilts a philosopher toward mystical thought rather than pure rational abstraction. Fourth and final point to synthesize is that it regards the significance of mystical philosophy today. And I know we didn't make this the forefront of our focus today, Orion, but I feel like this is a topic we could pursue a whole episode on, and maybe that's what we'll do for our next Dialogos, if you're game. But the question of why mystical philosophy matters today um, is, you know, needs some fleshing out. But implicit in our discussion today, I think it was that it's not just an ancient phenomena. It persists in modern thinkers, scientists, and artists. Mystical traditions offer a way of life, not just a system of thought. They provide ethical orientation, existential meaning, and a participatory way of knowing. The mystical and the rational don't have to be opposed. Many of our great thinkers, as we've discussed, embody both modes of inquiry. So those, for me, Ryan, are those the key connections I think we've arrived at over the course of our conversation. Did you want to comment on any of those, or offer any elaborations or refinements regarding any of those?
Just one sec. Yeah, I think one of the significant things to consider about how mystical philosophy impacts today or is important today or um, is how are these things operating in your life already in ways that you might not be aware of? So like uh, or how can you implement these in ways consciously and effectively? So
Mm-hmm.
if you have certain beliefs that you hold true, what sort of rituals and practices can you engage in to deepen your relationship with those values and those principles? Um, and being able to examine like maybe what in your life is taking away from that relationship or those practices. So yeah, I think those are things that are important to consider. Um, you know, not everybody might go to church or have a faith or whatever, and I think there's still things that like you can do to have some sort of grounding and and have some sort of sense of community and shared vision for the world. So um, yeah, I think learning about mystical philosophy, learning about mystical experiences kind of be a gateway into that, um, and hopefully a gateway into like community building, relationship building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's an important and really valid point you bring up there. We didn't so much touch upon the practices specifically; they were kind of more in the background. I'd be happy to go into those in some depth in our next conversation. But I guess at a first pass, right now I think we're seeing resurgence in spiritual practices in our culture right now. People gravitating towards, if they're not, identify with a traditional religion. We at least see people, going to yoga studios, cultivating mindfulness, wanting to be practice sort of integration of mind and body through practices, say like yoga or tai chi, or even going for a long hike, even by volunteering for nonprofit organizations that aimed at helping those who are vulnerable, or so on and so forth. These are all ways of practically engaging with the world that bring you back into contact with um, maybe um, your core authentic self, and also with the larger reality that you inhabit, which that self is a part of. And um, I think that that's a pivotal point, really. And I think the issue of practicing philosophy and not just merely contemplating philosophy is that core differentiating factor of the mystic in some important ways. Um, but in any event, maybe we can bring things to summation, Ryan, not unless you're itching to get anything else onto the table now.
There's some food on my table.
Right, right.
Getting
Well,
hungry.
yeah, yeah. Well, a philosopher can't survive on thought alone. There's food for thought, but then there's food for the stomach, and both are just as important. Maybe the latter more so, at least according to Abraham Maslow. But in any case, let's just close things up. Let's close the circle. Let's end by reflecting on the journey of our conversation and revisit the initial question, what we have discovered about the origins of mystical philosophy. And I think it'd be useful to just highlight some of the key takeaways and to leave things kind of open ended to invite further thought. So, to synthesize all this, I'd say our key takeaway is that mystical philosophy isn't just a social construct, just a response to human psychology, or just a metaphysical insight. It's an emergent phenomenon that arises at the intersection of all three. It reflects something fundamental about human nature, but also something real about the universe itself. So, to close, let's reflect on both the personal and the universal dimensions of mystical philosophy. Here's one possibility. If mystical philosophy is neither purely a social construct nor purely a metaphysical truth, but something that emerges at the intersection of human experience and cosmic reality, then what does that mean for how we live? Should we engage with mystical traditions as pathways to deeper understanding, or should we remain skeptical and treat them as cultural artifacts? And if mystical philosophy does reveal something real about the cosmos, what implications does that have for our search for meaning today? As I said previously, philosophy isn't about arriving at final answers. It's about refining the way we ask questions. So I'll leave you with this one. If mystical philosophy bridges the gap between human experience and cosmic reality, how should we engage with it in our lives? Sit with that, explore it, and as always, stay curious, stay open, and keep the Dialogos alive.